My name is Joe Dalton, entrepreneur and business coach. Welcome to Breakthrough Brands. Each week we bring you an inspirational story and an insight to the minds of some of the top business leaders, authors and mentors from around the globe. Whatever is needed to make you shine in life and business, you'll find it here.
Hello and welcome to Breakthrough Brands. This is Patrick Daly sitting in for your regular host, Joe Dalton. And today we will be speaking to Hugh Kelly of Associated Marketing. Hugh is a recognised expert in the field of international business and export market development. And he's the Managing Director of Associated Marketing Limited, an export management company. Now, Hugh, you call your business an export management company. What exactly is that, and what kind of services do you provide?
Well, what we do is if we are approached with a product or identify a product, an Irish product that we think has potential in export markets, we will offer to back the company that manufactures or owns that product, to back them to help them grow an export market. It's an unusual service. We don't charge a fee, we don't take equity, but what we offer to do instead is to back them for a minimum of 5 years to build an export region. For example, Scandinavia or the Middle East are two areas that we focus on. And for 5 years we will work with them to set up sales channels and to build their sales in those markets.
And what kind of companies, Hugh, would be the ideal users of your services, and what benefits do they get from working with you?
Probably those that benefit the most are companies that are sort of 2 million up to about 8 million in turnover. They manufacture finished products. They could be food, they could be nutritional supplements that sell through pharmacy channels, they could be agricultural machinery, they could be construction products. The product doesn't really matter. Our expertise is channel development. Their expertise are their products. So we don't duplicate. We're not trying to be product experts, we're channel experts. And that's the skill and the support that we offer them.
And when a company comes to you, ideally, what pre-work should they have done? What should they already know in order to get the best out of your services?
Well, companies tend to approach us and they have excellent product presentations. But the truth is a product presentation could be produced in a vacuum and still look excellent. The presentations and the material that really helps a company to grow into an export market, that allows us to excite potential distributors and agents to take on their products, are presentations and collateral that evidence the successes they've had to date, the material they've built, the knowledge they've built, the credibility they've built, testimonials. Those are the more valuable assets that we can use to develop their export markets for them, because channel partners want to partner with success. So we have to sell success and entice the best channel partners for those companies to want to work with them, to want to secure their product line for their markets.
And you mentioned earlier that you don't charge a fee. So what exactly is the revenue stroke cost model for the client company and for you?
So what we do is we will take over all the costs, all the upfront front-loaded costs of developing the market. That means identifying a channel partner, negotiating contracts, putting those in place. And then when the orders come in, we will process the orders and we will arrange their delivery, and we'll take all the debtor risk without recourse. We will guarantee payment to the Irish client. So we take the international contract risk and the international credit risk. And in return, we take a percentage of sales. But our fees are entirely success related, and that's what makes it so attractive for companies, mid-sized companies and small companies that may want to expand their exports, but perhaps all their resources are fully committed at that point.
And would these companies generally have or not have their own export department? Are you a a replacement for that, or are you complementary to that?
We are entirely complementary to that, not a replacement. The idea is that a company can look at a market that they'd love to look at, but they don't have the internal resources. Perhaps they don't have the internal competence, but many of them do already have an export sales manager or export sales team. But we're introducing them to another region so that they can scale more quickly.
Okay. And then going into a market, what are the typical routes? I guess some people maybe export directly, or they have distributors. What other possible routes are there?
Well, typically we'd work with finished products, so we're looking for either agents or distributors, or in some limited cases we might be looking for direct end accounts. For example, if you're selling into a retail chain, you might establish a direct account with a retail chain. But generally speaking, we're looking for distributors or we're looking for agents. There are other options, of course, for entering export markets. Larger companies might open their own sales offices, they might form joint ventures, they might buy a local company. But we tend to work with companies for whom the best market entry strategy is generally either an agent or a distributor.
Okay. Let me take you on a journey back in time, maybe, back to when you started the business. So how long have you been in business, and how did you start the business, and why did you start the business?
Well, the business was started in 1970, so I wasn't involved then. I was only 2 years old. But I went to college and I became an engineer, and I travelled the world with engineering, and I came back to Ireland in 1993 and I joined Associated Marketing and spent a couple of years doing an MBA at night to try and understand what the accountants were telling me and what a balance sheet and a P&L looked like. And then I took over the business as managing director in 95 and bought it out over the following 5 years. So it now has, now that we're in 2018, we're in our 48th year.
And in that period, 1995, say to 2000, when you were taking on the business and you were buying out, I guess, the previous owners, what kind of obstacles did you face in that period as you developed the business over those early years?
Well, the objectives we set for that period were to expand the company geographically. And in 1995 we went into Australia and New Zealand for the first time. They became excellent markets for us, and also into Southeast Asia, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, and later we looked at China and Northeast Asia, and that increased our reach beyond the Middle East, where we've been heavily focused, and some European markets.
And what resources did you need to access in those early days, and where did you get those from? And when did you actually realise that for you, at least, in your ownership of the business, that it was going to work for you?
Good questions. Probably the most valuable resource I had was youth. It's a hell of a long way.
Energy, yeah?
It's a hell of a long way to Australia. 23 and a half hours flying time. Throw in the stopovers and you're up to perhaps 30 plus hours. And New Zealand is another 3.5 hours further. Innocently, I thought New Zealand was next to Australia as Ireland is next to England. But it's a hell of a long way away. Apart from that, the challenges were, this was pre-internet. The internet was only starting. I recall going to New Zealand once and looking for a partner for one of our clients, a distributor or an agent, and we had done the most excellent desk research. And when I got there, one after another, the companies I met were not suitable. And the last day, with only a few hours to go before the flight, I opened the yellow pages or golden pages, whichever they called it, and rang some potential customers and put on the thickest Irish accent I could and asked them would they let me come in and talk to them about this product. And intrigued, they let me. I went in, spoke to them, and at the end of the meeting they asked me, how can we help you though? And I said, well, who calls on you that you really enjoy meeting, that you look forward to seeing walking through your door? And I was given the names of 3 agents that no amount of desk research could have identified for me. I phoned them quickly. One of them cancelled a meeting, came in to see me, we clicked, and they became our agent for 15 years in New Zealand for that product.
Amazing. So, and in that period, so that's 1995 to now, which is, how long is that?
23 years.
23 years. So along the way, what were the key pivot points, maybe where you had to change tack with regard to the service offering or the organisation of the business or the sectors or markets that you wanted to pursue?
Without a doubt, the biggest pivot point was, of course, the recession. Thankfully, we were involved in export markets, so we were somewhat insulated. But that wasn't that wasn't a complete solution for us, because our clients weren't necessarily insulated, and a number of our clients became stretched, and some of them worse, by the recession. So that was a tough time for us, like everyone else. Even though we were in exports, we had to cut our cloth to measure, and we had to adjust our offering, and indeed adjust our market focus, so that we weren't spread so thinly.
Okay. And what do you know now that you wish you had known then, at the beginning?
Gosh, that's a difficult question. Partly because you've asked me as if there was only one thing that I had learned. I could probably write a book. There are lessons I picked up that I pass on to people when they're looking for export partners. And they probably summarise some of my learning, because sometimes one can appoint people because they're so anxious to appoint someone, and they're so anxious to say they've secured a distributor or an agent. And I have 3 lessons that I like to share with people when they're evaluating potential partners, because setting up a partnership, setting up a distributor, it's like a marriage. And you've got to go into it carefully and with a lot of consideration if it's going to work. And the 3 things I stress to people are: make sure that you're culturally aligned. You've got to get on. You've got to like them. Make sure that size-wise they are suitable for your company. If you don't represent 15% of their business within 2 to 3 years, or 15% of the relevant part of their business, you're not going to be significant for them. But perhaps the most important criteria is hunger. And I have learned to put a huge store on that, and that if a company, a potential distribution partner or agent, has to be convinced too hard to take on your product, it's not going to work ultimately. They need to want you as much as you want them.
Mm-hmm. And with regard to exports in general, and in as much as we know about what Brexit is going to be like, how do you see it affecting Irish exports, both maybe in the negative sense and perhaps also in the positive sense?
The negative sense has been heavily documented, perhaps overly emphasised, and not because it isn't real, but because it's always good to try and be positive when you approach challenges. Some of the negative aspects, the German-Irish Chamber of Commerce did a study and identified that every border that has to be crossed can add up to 8% to the costs of goods. So many of our goods go across the land bridge through the UK into Europe. If that became 2 borders, you're talking about 16%. That's pretty significant. Other concerns have related to the actual physical movement of those goods across the borders and the delays at those borders if new procedures come into place. And then we've got the currency risk, and if the UK economy slows down, it will inevitably slow the Irish economy. On the other hand, it's an opportunity for us to hone our export strategies, something we should be doing all the time anyway, and perhaps to diversify our markets, which is wise anyway. And there are some great EU markets we can look at. We spend a lot of time helping companies get into Scandinavia now. They're largely English-speaking, or can speak English even if we can't speak their languages, and they are EU-aligned, if not part of the EU. So I think the opportunities are always there for those who look for them. It's too easy to be negative, but I think it's also important not to just hope that the problem won't happen. Mm-hmm. I think you need to be proactive.
And when you say Scandinavia, which countries are we speaking about specifically?
Well, Sweden is the largest by far, so that's really the jewel. But Denmark, Sweden, Norway and Finland are all markets that Irish companies should be looking at.
Okay, so I think Finland are in the Euro and the EU. Sweden and Denmark are in the Union but not in the Euro.
That's correct. Denmark and Sweden don't use the Euro.
Yeah. And Norway have an associated status.
They're in the EEA.
Okay, which is possibly where the UK may end up in some form of...
May, or even a lighter version perhaps.
Yeah, perhaps.
One can only hope.
So, given that scenario, what advice would you give to, say, an Irish SME that has depended up to now on the UK for its export business, or hasn't exported and is considering embarking on exports, and the natural thought process would be, well, UK is the first stop. So what would you be saying to those types of businesses now?
The first thing they have to do is validate their value proposition. Is it appropriate to the market they're looking at? Very often people go to the UK because they speak English, because they're familiar with it, they might well have visited it, and therefore they're comfortable going to it. For the same reason, people sometimes look to the US, although that can be a challenging market to enter. So you need to validate your value proposition. Does your product have appeal in the market you're looking at? And there's no way to do that except by getting on a plane and going over and having a look around and speaking to people and speaking to potential customers. Nothing replaces getting out and getting a feel for the market firsthand.
So if I'm thinking not about the UK and I'm thinking of, say, the European Union, other countries, and I'm getting on a plane, what is the situation with language? How do you view that? Are we depending on the people in the markets that we're going to sell to speak our language, or do we need to do something on our side with regard to that?
Embarrassingly, we're largely depending on them. Unfortunately, we largely can. Those in business tend to have English speakers in their team or can speak English superbly already. So I have, while I used to speak French and I studied in France at one stage and was very proud of the fact that I wasn't too bad a French speaker. Regretfully, I don't think I've used it since, because I still feel the French I speak to are better at English than I could ever be at French.
Okay. For you, over the years, what's the best business advice that you have received yourself from others?
I like the advice that everything you are asked to do, you ask, is this getting me nearer or further from my goal? And making sure that you maintain your focus that way.
Focus and clarity.
Focus and clarity.
Do you use mentors in any way, informally or formally?
I do. I have always had a board, but I've also had a larger advisory board that I always bounce ideas off. It's invaluable. It's invaluable to get alternative points of view, and it's invaluable because nobody has a monopoly on knowledge.
I think I read in your biography that you have a keen interest in history. Is that right?
I do, yes. I tend to read history all the time. And what's interesting was I never did it in school, or at least I gave it up as soon as I could because I was useless at the exams. But I love reading history. The only downside is that we do seem to repeat it frequently.
For the bad, for the worst, yeah? So what period of history would you have liked to have lived through, and why?
I think the Middle Ages in Britain are fascinating. The era of the Tudors. I think that ancient Rome and Greece, fascinating. The era of the consuls and the emperors. And the civilizations of early Greece. And some of the things that they worked out that we're still working out again.
Yeah. And also you're a sailor. So where do you sail, and what kind of sailing do you do, and do you compete, or have you competed?
Oh yes, we compete. I like to say I'm not very competitive, but my crew doesn't agree. I sail out of Dunleary and it is my passion. I think there's nothing quite as amazing as having to slow down at the end of a work day and get into the rhythm of the sea and the wind and feeling it on your cheek and working in harmony with the team to get a boat into the groove. And it can be incredibly exciting when you're approaching a start line, all these boats charging down, trying to hit the start at the same time. The start line isn't long enough and they're like a row of trucks, except the only problem is none of them have brakes.
So what other things do you like to do when you're not working then, besides reading history and sailing boats around Dunleary Harbour?
I have a weakness for golf as well.
Okay.
But it's a love-hate relationship. I recall someone saying to me that they called it golf once because it was the only four-letter word left.
And tell me, what have you been reading lately? What would you recommend in terms of what you have read, say, over the last year or so?
I read an excellent book called The Power of Habits, which talks about how to get people to habitualize consuming your product. brilliant book for anybody in the consumer products sector. One of the stories in it is about Pepsodent toothpaste, where they could not get people to wash their teeth, even though they knew it would stop their teeth rotting. And Pepsodent came along and they put a zing into their toothpaste that made people feel their mouth was fresh and clean straight after they'd brushed it. The zing did absolutely nothing except convince them that they should wash their teeth every day, and it transformed the industry. And it's those sort of insights into how to drive habits, drive consumption. It's a brilliantly written book with many different examples, and I'd highly recommend it to anyone in business who wants a light but compelling read.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Hugh, for talking to us today. It's been a pleasure, and today we're going to play out on a piece of music that I listened to recently that I found fascinating and very entertaining by a local artist, and his name is Daniel John Paxton, and the piece of music is called Morning Crow.
Morning crow, wake me from dreaming, fly away and lead me to the evening. To my love is waiting at the station, she is leaving me behind. Morning crow, you know that I'm not sleeping, and I know that she must go. Morning crow, I should have read the warnings, now she's run to another man's arms. Now she's run to another man's arms. As the night begins to follow me now, and I travel along the road to a bed that's sleeping only one now, and a bottle full of you. Morning crow, you know that I'm not sleeping, and I know that she will go. Morning crow, I never read the warnings, now she's run to another man's arms. Now she's run to another man's arms.
This show was sponsored by Harris Myers, your sales and marketing agency, helping you develop a better sales and marketing pipeline.